Imagine Moses sitting and contemplating the final address that he will give to the Jewish people. Imagine with me Moses's inner thought process and conception of his last words. Ela hadivarim. These are the words. This week we begin a new parsha. We begin a new chumash of the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, which of course in Hebrew, Devarim refers back to the entirety of Moses' address throughout the 30 plus chapters of this book. How did it get the name Deuteronomy, by the way? Well, Deutero means second, and the Nami part comes from nomos, which means law. And thusly we have a repetition of the law, a Mishneh Torah, as in the title we use for the Rambam, Maimonides, because he was restating the laws of the Jewish people. The book of Deuteronomy is a restatement in many ways of all of the laws and the Torah's holiest teachings that Moses delivers through his address, his words, his Devarim to the Jewish people during the 40th year in the wilderness, before Am Yisrael would live out their dream and fulfill the promise of entering the Holy Land. I imagine Moses' farewell address to have been thought about and conceived and built through meditative moments that Moses consciously took to consider what words he would share. I imagine that he sometimes had insights and inspiration as he walked along the way, familiar paths of desert stone, or something new that caught his eye and then sparked in his mind a way of addressing the Jewish people or teaching that he had to give over, or a piece of history that he might want to include. Those sudden insights that we get through wandering ourselves, through taking a walk, through spending some time in the park, even on the familiar paths, coupled with the carefully considered words and organized thoughts that we have when it comes to creating speeches or making a presentation. They're both essential components to develop the kind of address or speech or thoughts that we want to share, especially at holy moments in our lives. This indeed was a holy moment for Moses. This was a self-acknowledged final address. I imagine he thought about it quite consciously, topically, and taxonomically, and reviewed the history. And he also thought about it tenderly, meaning that he thought through the who he was addressing, and the when, and the where. He thought about all the souls who had left Egypt and who were there no longer. And he thought about the tribes and the leaders of the tribes. And he thought about the elders, and he thought about the youth, Bnei Yisrael. He thought about all of the Jewish people being children in the eyes of God. I imagine he also remembered the rebels and the complainers and the accusers. how he loved them all. Moses was going to share his love with the Jewish people at the end of his life. And yes, it was going to be through a little reproof and a rebuke. And yes, it was going to be a reteaching of laws that already were taught once, but needed to be interpreted and needed to be explained and needed to be explicated and expanded upon in order for the Jewish people to receive them, each or every one of the souls according to his or her own strength, as the Midrash says, was the Sinai experience. How much he still loved them. He was their dedicated teacher, their master teacher. What words shall I share? Eze divarim, before ele hadivarim. Which words shall I speak? I imagine Moses thinking about, contemplating consciously, being so surprised as he walked through the desert trails to say, yes, I must include that. What a great example. What a moment in our history that we learned something. I believe, as at least one of his motivating questions, he considered his final address to be inspiration for continuing the journey. How shall I prepare the next generation to keep the promise, to build this nation, and to fulfill the words of God? According to the great German theologians Kiel and Delitzsch, who wrote a commentary on what they consider to be the Old Testament in the 19th century, Moses speaks like a dying father to his children. The words are earnest, inspired, impressive. He looks back over the whole of the 40 years of their wandering in the desert and reminds the people of all the blessings they have received, of the ingratitude with which they have so often expressed, and of the judgments of God, and the love that continuously supported them despite it all. He explains the laws again and again, and adds what is necessary to complete them. He's not weary of urging obedience to them in the warmest and most emphatic words, because the very life of the nation was bound up with all of this. He surveyed all the storms and conflicts, and beholding the future in the past, took a survey of the future history of the nation, and saw with mingled sorrow and joy how the three great features of the past, apostasy, punishment, and pardon, continue to repeat themselves in the future also. The Ramban, Nachmanides, whose commentaries we have been studying this year, categorizes it in a little bit of a different way in his Presi, his Hakdama, the preface to his commentary for Deuteronomy. It's wonderful that we have such a preface before the commentary on individual chapters. It was a new feature in literary circles at the time the Ramban was writing, and here he embraced it. For instance, we don't have a preface for Rashi, and nor do we for some of the other Mefarshim, the early commentators of Torah. So in his preface, he says, before Moses began to offer elegant elucidation of the Torah, he began with rebuking them, to remind them of the times they missed the mark. Kama yamaruhu b'midbar, the times that they defied him in the wilderness. And yet, How God really enacted so many of the consequences through the aspect of mercy and not necessarily strictest deen, strictest judgment. Be merciful now. Moses was telling himself, potentially. Even in your reproof, Moses, make sure they know that you're revisiting these moments of suffering in our history so that they could become better people, more attached to God's holy law and to each other. This is why we, in this moment of preparing for the fast of Tisha B'Av, revisit the tragic moments and the sufferings in Jewish history. Not to say, woe is me, but to rise from those times where we were receiving such blows and to recommit to the holy paths in front of us and the proverbial promised lands that lie before us. In pointing out that Deuteronomy begins with a rebuke and then explanations and elegant elucidation, the Ramban might be leaving out one part of his commentary that he himself wrote on the first half of the first chapter of Deuteronomy. In a lovely moment, as the parsha begins in chapter 1, Moses stops after describing some of their journeys through the wilderness, the actual journeying and walking through the wilderness, sometimes arriving to named places on the map, and understanding that sacred experience was about the destination and the journey in Jewish terms, and letting people understand that, as there would be one day a sacred place to which to make pilgrimage, and many sacred places within our precincts, our holy precincts, as Jewish people. After those descriptions of wanderings in the desert, Moses stopped and reminded folks in verse 6 of chapter 1, Adonai Eloheinu diber eleinu b'chorev. God spoke to us at Sinai. Rav lachem shevet bahar hazeh. When you had enough time at the mountain, you were then off to your journey. Laws at Sinai would sustain you through your desert wilderness adventure. And see, I have given you this land before you, verse 8. Already at the beginning of Deuteronomy, we're reminded of the greatness of Torah in our lives, of the promise of the Holy Land. There's no rebuke here. There's Moses being self-reflective. And in verse 9, he said to the children of Israel, Va'omar alechem ba'et hahi lemor, lo uchal levadir se'edetchem. I am not able to carry you all by myself. In this way, Moses inspires each soul, all of the people in front of him, to realize, I am just one leader. And yes, I have been the one to lead you out of Egypt, but in your future, there will be others who will lead. A foreshadowing of the very end of the book, when we see the ascension of Joshua, who takes command and leads the next generation into Canaan. He says again, Eicha esa levadi. How can I bear this leadership, man, this mantle of leadership? As if to say, on the one hand, he did go through some very rough times as a leader and felt challenged and accused, angered by the complaints. And on the other hand, with this word Eicha, we know from the fact that it's the first word of the prophet Jeremiah's book, Lamentations, that we'll read on Tisha B'Av, saying, how could we really have gotten to this place. And what will help us return to God's ways? What will help us lift ourselves out of this place of despondency and even sadness that the first generation is no longer here with us? Moses says, I understand that you had troubles. I understand that you had a lot to bear. I understand you had quarrels among you out in this wilderness. And the second half of verse 12 says it in just those three words. Tarchachem umasa'achem v'rivachem. I couldn't do it alone. And I know you had troubles. I know you had much to bear. I know you had arguments between you. Sometimes that verse is read as if Moses was rebuking them, casting them back into those moments of deplorable history of the first generation that led God to get upset and tell Moses he was going to have them suffer consequences. But on the other hand, they could be read as Moses recognizing the spiritual struggles and the everyday life struggles that people had in the wilderness. Like a tender father to his children, like a shepherd tending his flock. The Ramban points out that when he said you had troubles, that Moses recognized that maybe they had some trouble learning the laws and the statutes of the Torah. Amar tarchachem keneged v'hodati et chukei ha'Elohim ve'et toratav. I know that you had trouble learning the laws and the statutes of God and the Torah of Hashem. I know that it was not easy. And maybe in this way, he's saying that we have to be careful to appoint the right teachers in our future so that we indeed can explain, elegantly share the kind of explanations that will bring understanding and elucidation that will help us see clearly in our minds the great messages of the Torah's teachings, the moral grandeur of the passages, the stories, and the verses. And when he said, Masa'achem, that you had great burdens, the Ramban connects that word, Masa'achem, keneged lidrosh Elohim. He connects that to the spiritual lives, the inner lives of all the children of Israel. I know you had it so hard when you wanted to connect with Adonai Eloheinu and not just let me be the intermediary. Sure, you sent me up the mountain, but I know you wanted to lead Rosh Adonai as well. And isn't that our longing when we develop our prayer life? If not to cling to God, to lidrosh me Hashem, to know from God. What is the way forward, God? Sometimes we need a blessing from you. Sometimes we need instruction from you. Spiritual life. I know you will be challenged to find a way into that path. But this is a wonderful journey to go forward with. And then with the Rivachem, you had arguments and you quarreled and you had disagreements. Moses is preparing them. You'll disagree. There will be more than two sides to every argument. You'll sit in the Beit Midrash and find 70 ways to make something impure pure, and 70 ways that something pure is going to be impure. These will actually qualify your judges to be the smart and thoughtful people you need to help adjudicate matters when litigants come before the Beit Din, before the court. Know how to listen to one another. Moses blesses the people that the judges and that people themselves will make space to shamoa bein achechem. Listen to your brother. Listen to one another, even if you disagree. In verse 16 of chapter 1, Moses explained how he instructed the judges who would uphold the holiest law, to truly listen to one another. This is the invitation that Moses made at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. The rebuke does begin when he took the heads of the tribes and appointed spies and said to the Meraglim, go figure out the way we're going to get into the land of Canaan. And they came back and said, we're nothing but grasshoppers in their eyes. They could not muster the courage that was needed, nor the strength, that first generation. And that's why Moses had to say, now it's up to you. Now it's up to you in this generation. Learn this Torah. Connect with God. Understand the nature of your Talmudic reality. Go forward on your journey. Accept the new leadership that will come. Appoint teachers, educators, instructors. Inspire one another so that you will reach the true promised land that God promised to your ancestors and promises you. When we think about the message for Deuteronomy in our time and the blessing that Moses made to the children of Israel to truly listen to one another and to understand the cogent arguments and the sensible positions and deliberate among yourselves in order to come to the best decision possible so that you'll forge holy paths and blaze new trails. More than ever, we need those holy words to guide us. Ele ha-divarim. These are Moses' holy words. Shabbat shalom.